Namaste. It's important for my movement that you please subscribe to my channel and share it with your friends. My involvement starts when IIT Kharagpur sent Infinity Foundation a grant proposal. They were going to celebrate their 50th anniversary. This is like 17, 18, 19 years ago. And they wanted funding for various conferences on various topics. So I looked through all the topics, and the one I found most intriguing was called Mind Sciences. So I looked at the details, and it was all Western thought, and there was not a single speaker or panel on Indian psychology or Indian mind sciences. So I wrote back saying I'm happy to fund the mind sciences, provided there should be at least one panel on Indian theories of mind. I got a very nasty reply saying, we are not saffron, we are not chauvinists, we are scientists, and we don't believe in these sort of things. I kept a copy of that till today. So maybe this person who's joining the faculty I'll give you a copy, you should take it and show it to them. So then what I did is, I know that these people will be excited if some Westerners are talking about Indian mind sciences. So I went to Bob Thurman, who's a Buddhist friend of mine in Columbia, and I talked to one guy in Cambridge. He had written a book on Patanjali Yoga Sutra. There was one Sri Aurobindo follower who was a psychiatrist in New York. There's one Kundalini practitioner. So I got hold of 4 or 5 Westerners, and I said, we'll fund you, why don't you go and do this panel on Indian mind sciences, and make sure you tell them about the sources which are in Sanskrit, and which guru taught you, and how you practice it, and how you teach it in the West, and all of that. So they sent me their abstracts, and I submitted these to IIT Kharagpur saying this is the kind of panel we should have, and because it was Westerners, they immediately accepted it. So then they got standing ovation, and I think one of the persons we funded also was Kundan. He was telling me yesterday, he refreshed my memory. So that started a whole lot of proposals from all over Indian universities, Kerala and Pondicherry and here and there. They all wanted to host these Westerners to talk about mind sciences, because after all, if Westerners are saying we have something good, must be true. So that was how I got into this. We funded many years, many programs to do with Indian psychology, mind science and so on, and then I got into it as a scholar doing my own research. The subject I'm talking about is as part of a book I'm doing. This is just an overview of a book project, multiple volumes on Indian contributions to the mind sciences, and the mind science appropriation by the West, and then reframing it, recharacterizing it into their own terminology, is a very major project that has been going on. It is part of digestion of Indian civilization into Western civilization, or at least what they want out of it. So it's like the analogy I give, that a tiger likes a prey, could be a goat or a deer or whatever, and after consuming it, whatever it likes, it digests, becomes part of the tiger's cells, and whatever it didn't like is rejected. And so the tiger is a stronger tiger, and the deer is gone. No more deer left. So digestion is different from appropriation. You can appropriate with respect, without distorting, without harming. But it becomes a problem only if you appropriate, you recharacterize it, you hide some of the sources, you change the meaning in some way, because the original will not fit. And after changing the meaning, very subtle way, I'll give you many examples from Jung to Ken Wilber to many people. After removing what you don't like out of it, what won't fit, you recharacterize and remap it into a new vocabulary of your own. And then you in fact say, this is my universal discovery, I've made it, and you re-export it back to people in India also. and they'll gladly accept it because after all it's American now or something like that. So that then the authenticity of the tradition is lost as a result of this. So I have been studying this for 25 years in many domains, from linguistics to botany to whatever. And now I'm focusing on getting my books out on mind sciences, the Indian contributions which are often ignored. The beginning of this period, this process is the process that I'm going to look at. The process has been going on for a long time, but early 1900s, Ferdinand Saussure, a French scholar, creates a framework called structuralism. And structuralism, he's considered the father of structuralism. And then there is a post-structuralism later, and this becomes postmodernism. So the origin of postmodernism is from Saussure times onward. But Saussure himself was a Sanskrit scholar. His PhD was in Panini grammar. So he's certainly knowledgeable. And he takes the idea of vak, the 4 levels of vak, the vakhari, which is external speech, madhyam, which is internal speech, pashyanti, which is sort of like subconscious or unconscious level, deeper, transcending the conceptual mind, and then the para, which is collective and universal consciousness. He takes that and deletes the para to secularize it. So he deletes the para, and the other 3 he maps into his vocabulary, and that starts structuralism. A lot has been written on this. In fact, Professor Kapil Kapoor in a book wrote quite a lot about this. So this is an example of digesting something, but never completely. You take out what won't fit, because this idea of para is not going to fit. It's a kind of one of those things. So this goes on, this kind of process of taking something and only accepting what the filter allows you to bring in, discarding everything else, and then reformulating it in your own vocabulary, and denying the source or rejecting the source. This is a common pattern that goes on quite a bit. And so the traditions have been mined, the Indian traditions, there's a mining expedition, the traditions have been mined through science, through Indology, religious studies, even gurus. Sometimes our gurus are, in order to market and present our knowledge in a way that the others will accept, they compromise and they westernize it in the spirit of, with good intention sometimes, but not realizing that they are actually distorting it in some ways. And so I give a lot of examples of that in my work. And so this is I have a lot of very colorful diagrams here showing how the flow charts work and all that, and I'm not going to be able to show you. So what I should do is, the consequence of all this is that we have lost a lot of our ecosystem, our civilizational ecosystem. At one time we were producers of knowledge. You look at Nalanda, you look at Takshila, you look at all the rest of the world, so many people came to take the knowledge from us. So we were producers of knowledge. So then we became the consumers of other people's knowledge. So rather than we being the producer and exporter, we are the importer and consumer of knowledge. And sometimes there is a discourse going on about knowledge which we started, where we are neither producing nor consuming, we are just bystanders, we are onlookers, we are spectators, watching what is going on in a certain field. Very little clue that it really has a lot to do with our heritage. And even worse is if you are blissfully ignorant, couldn't care less, and I come across that a lot. Talk to people and make them aware that there is something about our heritage which has gone, we've lost it, forgotten it, we need to worry about it, bring it back, and the attitude is not very conducive to that. So the general comments I made about digestion, I'm now going to apply it to mind sciences specifically. And here I have Swami Vivekanand's impact. Swami Vivekanand, he made a huge impact on Western thought, including philosophy, including psychology, including William James. William James is considered one of the founding fathers of Western psychology, but what people don't often mention is that he hosted Swami Vivekanand. When Swami Vivekanand went to Harvard, James was the chair of philosophy at the time at Harvard. There was no psychology department separately, it was under philosophy. And Vivekananda even stayed in his house, so obviously they were very close. And William James also knew a couple of very scholarly Buddhists at Harvard at the time. So it's not that he developed all those ideas entirely on his own. There's quite a lot of correspondence. Now, William James is such a towering figure. At Harvard, there is a separate building called the William James Library. So there's a whole library on his thing. So I went there, spent some days, and I wanted to get access to the Vivekanand era, Vivekanand part of William Jones' life. And I thought there'll be a lot. And I got access to the special archive and the things that are not available to ordinary, you need permission. I got all of that. And this librarian was very friendly, and she looked and searched. They have a very sophisticated search and all that, and she found nothing. The word Vivekanand was not in the catalog, in the William James Library. I said, how can it be? Because William James brought Vivekanand. So then after a while they said that the Vivekanand part of the life of William James was removed and given to the Ramakrishna Mission, so you find it there. This is very strange. Why would they throw it out, So, and from the Ramakrishna Mission, there seems to be an internal politics between the Boston Ramakrishna Mission and the Santa Barbara Vedanta Society, each saying you go to the other one, and I never got access to this. So this is very, very strange. But there are secondary reports on what happened and so forth. So this is an archive I would love to get hold of. But Vivekanand's impact was on people like Aldous Huxley, Nikola Tesla, one of the most eminent physicists at the time. So the impact of some of these towering Indians who went there was huge. Now, I want to jump forward and talk about Carl Jung. But before I do Carl Jung, because I want you to know that Freud had Indian influence. This is something that is not known. People say that, well, we don't know. There is no explicit mention in his collected works. So people think it's not so. But I found a scholar who has Freud had correspondence with other Western thinkers at that time who actually were well versed in Indian psychology, who understood Indian thought very well, and the nature of the mind and all that, the theories, different theories from India, these scholars understood, and Freud was in dialogue with them, so indirectly through them he got this. And while these are not mentioned in the Freud collection, if you look at Freud collection, you don't find these kind of things. You find them in the collected works of these other people. So Freud is in correspondence with X. You find them in the complete works of X, but not a copy of it in the Freud side, which is also very strange. So I'm working more, I'm digging up a lot more about it. But let's talk about Jung. I have here a table of Indian construct and the corresponding Jungian construct. So Atman is self, sanskar he calls it memory seeds, karmic imprints and patterns he calls it archetypes, collective unconscious he takes from this Yogachara storehouse consciousness idea, and also Chitta from Sankhya. Rhythm, the cosmic rhythm in Vedas is synchronicity. So there's a whole mapping of his vocabulary. Certain words he keeps as is, like mandala and chakra and kundalini, So I have a diagram I want to describe because I can't put it up there. Imagine a workspace. Imagine you have a table and you are somebody who's going to put some jigsaw puzzle together. So I have a diagram of a workspace, Jung's workspace. And I'm imagining Jung is putting his theory together. There are 3 influences outside the workspace that he has to keep in mind. One is Indian thought he wants to appropriate. So there is a stack of things called Indian thought, and he's picking what he wants to appropriate, while sometimes acknowledging and sometimes not acknowledging. But he wants to appropriate. Then there is another influence called he wants to be seen as a scientist. So he wants to be empirical, which means he wants to say, I have done this inner exercise myself, I have experienced this, so it's empirical. That's the second influence. The third influence is very interesting, the third constraint. He wants to be Christian compliant. Throughout his life, he's having discussions with Christian bishops that his theory is not anti-Christianity and all that. It's actually quite compatible with Christianity. So he keeps coming up with these ideas from Indian thought, making it scientific, and also presenting it in a way that Christians can accept it. So he's trying to show that he has brought a new, more scientific interpretation of Christianity, and the Indian thought is a resource helping him do that. Then in the next diagram, I fill this circle called Jungian workspace. Using these outside influences, now he's built a theory. So I have got a diagram of what he gets out of the Indian thought, how he maps it to a different vocabulary, how he makes it compatible with the scientific paradigm, and also with the Christian paradigm. So he's sandwiched between 3 things. He wants as much as he can out of the Indian thought, but he wants to make sure he can pass it as science, and he can pass it as Christianity, as a new interpretation of Christianity. So in a nutshell, what he does is he accepts the lower 5 chakras. He rejects the top 2 chakras, because that's transcendence, and he can't make it fit with Christianity. That's transcendence. That's unity consciousness. Okay, that's something he could not reconcile with the Bible. He rejects this idea of a state of unity of Atman and Brahman. He rejects that, because that also won't fit. He rejects reincarnation. Very big point. Towards the end of his life, it is said that he reconsidered it, that he rejected reincarnation because it would not fit Christianity. And karma he accepts, but it is not an individual karma. The karma you are doing, it is all collective karma. So I could do whatever because it's going to affect all of us, not me. That's his idea, because the individual karma and then the reincarnation of that individual Jivatman does not fit. Why he changed his mind at the end of his life, I don't know. Maybe he figured, if I don't believe in reincarnation, I believe in heaven, hell, who knows, I might end up in hell. So maybe I picked the reincarnation option and come back here only. Maybe, I don't know if that was what bothered him. Now he does not accept samadhi. He does not accept samadhi. He does not accept the egoless transcendent state. So what he does is, those claims from the yoga tradition and the Indian tradition he doesn't agree with, and he says that these claims are hallucinations, or the yogis, whatever they're saying, it's just not scientifically valid. And his benchmark is whether he's been able to achieve it, which is fair enough. He doesn't want to take anything else for at face value. And his concern is to come up with a system which is incompatible with Christianity, because that would not be good for him. So I have here a whole lot of flowcharts on his limiting factors. He wants to limit the knowledge to his own yogic experience, what he could achieve. He wants to be constrained by Western science, premises, and he wants to make it fit into his new Christian thesis. These are the 3 constraints. And therefore he eliminates several things like reincarnation, human transcendence, beyond the archetypes, egoless state, samadhi, all of those things he doesn't accept. He concludes that Westerners should not practice yoga. It is dangerous. Westerners like him are expert and qualified to practice yoga and then come up with a new yoga for Westerners. But this Indian yoga may not be safe for you. He's very clear on that on multiple occasions. What the Indians are doing is fine for their culture, but we Westerners should not practice it. And therefore, it gives him a job as a middleman. He's going to broker this yoga. He's the one who's going to go and pick it up and figure it out and reconfigure it his own way and have you practice that. So, his influence is huge. Sometimes people tell me, why are you worrying? There's not much Jungian stuff. Most psychologists in the West are moved on to other things. You see, sometimes there's no influence of that particular person directly, but his thought has morphed into other ideologies. So, Jungian influence, you don't look for Jungians today, but there were these Erasmus conferences. There was a series of conferences in Switzerland by a widow who inherited a lot of money, and her passion was to bring Indian thought into the West. And Jung had this job of conducting summer institutes in the 1930s, teaching. He taught topics called Kundalini Yoga, chakras. These are titles of his lectures. If you look at his collected works, he's got lectures on these things. And this conference series, it then gets published in a very prestigious, Bollinger Foundation was created. A whole foundation was created to publish Jung's collected the proceedings, 30 some volumes, and now it's being printed by the Princeton University Press. Some of the alumni from Jung became very famous. Joseph Campbell, Martin Buber, Eliade, the University of Chicago, great fellow, Paul Radin, Rhys Davis, the great Buddhist scholars, Paul Tillich, one of the most important Christian theologians of his time, etc., etc., Heinrich Zimmer. So these people learned this stuff from Jung. They are not Jungians, but they are famous schools of thought in their own right. So he spawned many schools of thought, and therefore it's not fair to say that Indian influence wasn't that important because not too many Jungians around. The point is that, for instance, you take Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell's whole mythology and all that stuff is basically he's a Jung student. He's one of Jung's prominent, best students, and he's turned it into his own thing. And now that thing is morphed into Devdutt Patnaik and many other people, Wendy Doniger. So you see the influence goes through other people. There's a whole pipeline kind of an effect. I would say that one of the channels through which Indian thought kind of became very important in the West, one of these channels is Jung, another one is Freud, and there's many others that I'm going to talk about. Then I have this chart on Sri Aurobindo's impact, and there's 4 major channels. One is California Institute of Integral Studies. The second is Michael Murphy and Esalen. The third is Ken Wilber's Integral Institute. And the fourth is, unfortunately, and a controversial thing I'm going to say, many of Sri Aurobindo's own followers in India itself. They've also been kind of a little bit mixed up sometimes. And there's a whole human potential movement started by Michael Murphy and then Ken Wilber, which is actually an Aurobindonian movement reincarnated in another form, and a lot of input into consciousness studies. And his planes and parts of being has been appropriated, turned into many things in this cognitive science area. Now, I have a very iconic photograph I wish I could show you, where the founder of California Institute of Integral Studies is there with various other people, and Haridas Chaudhary, who was the first president and an Aurobindo follower. Now, the California Institute of Integral Studies was set up very explicitly in the founding papers in California for the purpose of spreading Sri Aurobindo's knowledge to the West. No doubt about it. That's what it was set up for. But see what happens After Haridas Chaudhary dies, I have these flow chart. The next president, Ralph Metzner, he's into drugs. He's into this drug culture and mysticism. So he's a scholar of, psychedelic and mysticism and things like that. And he has a certain impact on the California Institute of Integral Studies. But the biggest impact is person after him, Robert McDermott, who replaces Sri Aurobindo as a central figure with Jung and Rudolf Steiner, anthropomorphism. In fact, Sri Aurobindo's picture is removed from the institute, and these other people are replaced. And then comes Joe Sobiondo, who then takes it even further into other directions, and he brings in people like Angana Chatterjee, who start accusing Indian culture of human rights violations and all kind of horror. So here, here's an institute where the beginning is positive portrayal of India, exporting Sri Aurobindo's knowledge as something great, and it ends up in the hands of Angana Chatterjee and people like that, as characterizing the Indian source as kind of a human rights nightmare, while all its great positive things are now being attributed and replaced by Jungian thought and Ken Wilber and this one and anthropomorphism, all kind of Western models. Very sad story. Another case study. So in my book, I'm doing all these case studies of who are the intermediaries, individuals, institutions, schools of thought, funding agencies, who are the ones that are intermediating this flow of knowledge from India to the West. Another one is Esalen. And Esalen is something Michael Murphy starts. And Michael Murphy is a great figure in California who was Sri Aurobindo follower, very, very fond of him and writing books on those ideas, but then gradually taking them as his own ideas, mixing them up and modifying them. So Esalen was a place, it still is there, but it's no longer the same character. It was very important in the 60s as a place where a lot of figures, a lot of important Western figures would go and they could explore and experiment without the fear of the rules of the game. Inside the Western academy, you can't just explore crazy things. You can't say, I'm going to go on drugs and figure out what the hell happens. And you go on meditation and we'll see if the things the same in art. You don't do these, you can't do wild, crazy things. But in Esalen, you could do anything. So because it was not, it was a private institution. So it became a place where a lot of things from the Indian frontier that could be too dangerous for academics to ruin their reputation. These were tested, experimented. There were tantra peoples. There was experimentation with sex. There was all sorts of things going on. So they would bring Indians and they would bring Americans who've gone to India and understood these things and bring back. And this would be like a place to incubate new ideas. So some of the big names that are products of this Esalen culture. Andrew Weil, famous, alternate healing, and Dean Ornish, big figures in mind-body medicine today. If you look up Andrew Weil and Dean Ornish, huge figures. They're from the Esalen era in the early years. Arnold Toynbee, a big historian. Paul Tillich in theology. Joseph Campbell, Abraham Maslow, Stephen LaBarge. All of these guys had immersed themselves in Esalen. Rupert Sheldrake in biology. Michael Murphy took Sri Aurobindo's ideas about evolution and wrote his book, The Future of the Body. He wrote, this was his reconstruction of, and then Gary Zukov, physics of consciousness guy. So these are some of the influences that they did. Another person I'm studying a lot in this era is Ken Wilber. There's a separate volume of about 300 pages only on Wilber's appropriation of Sri Aurobindo. What he got right, what he got wrong, what he acknowledged, what he disguised, all of that, point by point. Putting a quote from Sri Aurobindo and the corresponding knowledge, the corresponding idea from Wilber, and comparing and saying, okay, these things he got right, these things he got wrong, this thing he hides and whatnot. So he's now a very iconic figure, Ken Wilber, he has plotted levels of human consciousness at various levels, and he's named them quite arrogantly Wilber 1, Wilber 2, Wilber 3, Wilber 4, Wilber 5. Wilber 1 is certain early books. He's a student studying Sri Aurobindo there, and Madhyamika Buddhism, Tantra, and Kashmir Shaivism. These are his source. And by Wilber 2, he claims that he superseded Sri Aurobindo. So he does some flow charts where the evolution he's showing himself at a certain level of consciousness, and the level below are certain other people like Sri Aurobindo sitting there. And then Wilber 3 has gone way beyond. Now he's finding serious faults with what Sri Aurobindo said, and so on. So that's how this process of digestion works. Another person I'm looking at in a lot of detail is the legacy of the influences of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Now Maharishi Mahesh Yogi influenced, Deepak Chopra was his student, lived in the ashram as a young man for many years. So did Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. Many people don't know this, but these were two of his closest students, looked after him. They were very younger to him and disciples of his. But from a science point of view, Herb Benson, an important figure in Harvard, studied the transcendental meditation using TM meditators as subjects for scientific measurement, and published the results of what meditation can do for you without saying that he's studying transcendental meditation, saying that he has developed a technique called relaxation response. That was his technique. Exact same procedure. If you take a relaxation response manual and you take TM manual and you make a column, it's exact thing. You practice them 20 minutes a day. There is this mantra. He doesn't have a Vedic mantra. He has his mantra is like one. You say one, and you substitute instead of saying Om. Instead of Om, you say one, or instead of any other mantra, whatever your bija mantra is, you reprove that and you say this one. So he says that he can produce the same effect, but he hasn't done experiments on people practicing his technique. He uses people who are practicing transcendental meditation, doesn't say that they're doing TM, and basically proposes that his theory it validates his theory of relaxation response, which is very strange. And he becomes a very big shot at Harvard. He starts something called the Mind Body Institute. They just closed it down recently. He's in his 90s. I don't know if he's still alive, but he was in his 90s 3-4 years ago. Huge personality. So when he left at 90 plus, he turned over all his boxes and boxes of notes and books and all his records, private information he had, to the Harvard Library, and they're going to create a special Herb Benson archive. And somewhere they announced that the archive is open to scholars on a special permission basis because it contains a lot of private stuff. Of course, that gets me going, it gets me very excited. Hey, I want to get my hands on this because I want to find out what's in it. But if I had gone there with my name, they would never give me permission. So I found a young, enterprising Indian neuroscientist at Duke University. And he wrote to me, he said, I'll do it for you. I said, oh, good. So we gave him a grant and we said, you go and get permission, and because you're a neuroscientist and you're a student, it looks very innocent, and you get us, tell me what is exciting there. So he goes and he has one of these iPhones, and this librarian gives him the rules that whatever you want to copy, you have to tell us. We'll charge you $1, we copy, you fill out a form, you can only copy 20 pages per box. There are so many boxes, you can't just go on copying everything. 20 pages per box. And certain boxes which are coded in this color, we have to get the family permission because they are very private, like that. So they leave him alone, but this guy is smart. He's got his iPhone, he just click, 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 click. I suddenly start getting hundreds of emails with a lot of attachments. So I told my secretary, print karo, start printing it. So I got a few thousand pages of Herb Benson's archive, and it's very insightful. Herb Benson got funding from many places, including Prince Charles. He went to Prince Charles, he got a letter saying that I'm discovering the deepest secrets of this East, and this could help move Western civilization to another level of consciousness. He writes like that. And he goes to India, he looks for various places in the mountains, there are some sadhus and gurus, and he's doing scientific measurements on them. And then he's also repackaging this transcendental meditation as something of his own. So he becomes Herb Benson is known as a very, very big shot. So I could write a book on just Herb Benson. Most of these guys, I could write whole book on each of them. But that'll just be too much to be produced. So I'm condensing the material that I have gathered on each of these individuals. And I don't know anybody who's been gathering this kind of so much material like I have been doing. I have a garage I've rented, storage garage, filled with boxes with this kind of stuff that I collect. Every time I find there's something interesting, I know that one day somebody will need it, so I go invest and catch it, get hold of it, do a scan and put it in this storage place. I have a lot of material. So if somebody wants to become an intern and help me, or become a research assistant and help me, I need that kind of help to sort through all of that. So then there's another one called Stephen LaBarge in Stanford, and he has a trademark, copyright, patented technique called lucid dreaming. And it is actually Yoga Nidra. That's what it is. I used to go to this consciousness studies conference in Tucson, Arizona. In the 1990s, I used to go every time. And I would always get quite upset that these guys going on talking about some new thing they've developed, some new psychology or whatever, but I knew that this is from India. They would not mention a word. So in the case of Stephen LaBarge, he agreed that we should go out and have a meal together. So we went and had this meal, and there I told him that this is Yoga Nidra. Then he was very kind of defensive. Then he said, yes, I learned it in Rishikesh, and so-and-so is my guru, and I have this picture of him, and all of that, trying to really impress me. I said, that's fine, but why aren't you public about it? Why is it that privately you're telling me all these things, but what's embarrassing publicly? So he gave me a very common Western answer who want to justify these things, very common excuse. He said, it's because of me that the Yoga Nidra will become popular and accepted, because I'm saying it, I'm Stanford, and so if I say it, the people will believe it. So it's like the chore saying that I will take your jewelry because it will look good if I'm wearing it. And so whereas if you are wearing it, they will not even think it's real diamonds, So I'm doing you a favor. This kind of a logic. Now, lucid dreaming, they have an institute in Europe, and 2 or 3 in USA. They're doing research, they're training people. One of the students of this lucid dreaming started his own movement, and he did experiments with the US Army in Iraq during the Iraq War to show that post-traumatic stress syndrome, which soldiers have when they are in battle, that lucid dreaming is a very, very good therapy for that. So the US Army conducted trials where they gave different modalities opportunity to treat post-traumatic stress syndrome, and based on the results, it was concluded that lucid dreaming is the best treatment for this kind of a disorder. And so this one fellow got a huge multi-million-dollar contract, and US Army very proudly saying that this discovery of this guy, this particular scientist, is helping cure PTSD. Actually, it's Yoga Nidra. But that's not how it's mentioned. So then another one, I've had a very intimate, all these are intimate encounters. It's not secondary, not Google search and copy paste. I've really gone and met some of these people, stayed with them, had encounters, spent a lot of energy to dig deep. So one of these is Templeton Foundation. They are probably the largest funding agency and organizer of science and religion, the interface between science and religion. So what we are talking about would be in that. So Infinity Foundation funded the first science and religion program in University of California in the 90s, and it was in the Santa Barbara campus, and it was a Buddhist person who was a student of Robert Thurman, so that's how I met him, and we discussed that we will teach the Dharma traditions and look at them and science and see what the relationship might be. So that went on for a while, and then suddenly we found that Templeton Foundation has hijacked that program because they offered 10 times more money to the university and replaced this fellow with their own team, took over the science and religion program, took the class notes, the knowledge that he had been teaching, and remapped it into a Christian framework, and that became the science and religion program. So I was quite upset. I wrote publicly. Then they called me and said, let's do something together. When they know that you got some information on them, then one method is to try and make you happy. So they, being a very big enterprise, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of budget, and mine is a tiny one. So they convinced Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, to hold a science and religion conference around 2001 to something like 2003, somewhere around that time frame. And they told me, you come along, it'll have credibility. You come along, otherwise, American company coming and doing it may not be credible. And I don't have that kind of money. But they said, you just give little bit, whatever symbolic, and we'll blow it up and say we are doing it together. So I said that we'll do it, I'll join only on the condition that I should have some say in what the content is, who we are inviting. So we had a decent conference together, and then I realized that they tried to appropriate quite a lot of people, that they actually used me to identify who are the smart people, because they said, you should select the people. So then I selected some people. And then I didn't realize that they'll go offer them money and take him. That was their idea, I did a conference in Woodstock, in New York, with Tibet House on Indic studies and consciousness. And the Templeton fellow just very innocently said, do you mind if I sit and come and attend? I don't want to say anything, I'll just sit and learn. And he's very nice, and I couldn't say no. So he's sitting there, and during the lunch break, we all go have lunch. And when I come back, he had tables, collapsible tables. He opened 3 or 4 long tables and put all the literature there. Templeton Foundation, grants available, $15,000 a year, $50,000 a year, $100,000 a year, and all our people running like bees running towards some honey. And so soon after that event, many of the people that I had nurtured, some of them nurtured in this way, disappeared. They went and got Templeton grants because Templeton got so much money. I mean, I don't want to mention names, but I've publicly talked about these people. One of them, we funded a book on Indian psychology we were going to fund, but somewhere along the way he switched to Templeton funding, and so we lost that link from him. So these are serious hijacking activities going on, and people have to at least be aware of this. I'll switch to Buddhism. Buddhism is a different kind of a source for Western appropriation, because Buddhism they acknowledge more openly. It's not as weird as Hinduism. So they can acknowledge it's cool, they can acknowledge that we're getting this out of Buddhism. But I will show you that after they've gotten a lot out of Buddhism and they've acknowledged that it's out of Buddhism, then they start modifying it. There are certain things they will not keep and they'll modify them. So my Buddhism influence on the West is 4 volumes. 4 volumes I'm doing. The draft is around 1,300 pages total, and but it's very not clean, clearly written. I need to improve it. Again, I'm looking for assistance to help me. But first volume is Western philosophy, the influence on Western philosophy, which starts quite early. The second is psychology, theoretical models of mind and the Buddhist influences. The third is empirical research, actual research on Buddhists, which is very actively going on. Their meditation, what they can do, empirical research. And the fourth is clinical therapies that have been developed from Buddhism. That's also a very big movement. So one of the big figures in the appropriation of Buddhism is Jon Kabat-Zinn, who coined the term mindfulness. Actually, when you look at the technique, they're not filling your mind, they're emptying your mind. But unless you practice the technique, when you just see the word mindful, in the English language, when they say be mindful of this, it means you have to be thinking about it, but the actual technique is not making you think of anything. So the technique of vipassana is where it starts. So they make it mindfulness meditation, then it gets into stress reduction management, which is further away from the original purpose, because stress reduction is a side effect, it's not what the vipassana really is trying to do. So the Jon Kabat-Zinn movement, he was the first person who took a lot of Buddhist practices and put them through the rigor of the American medical system, because he's a medical doctor, and came up with patented, copyrighted, proprietary treatments for diabetes and for this and that and whatnot, all kind of things. So the pharmaceutical industry got a lot of benefit from it. So there is this dialectical behavior therapy, which is really a Buddhist technique, but it's got a very nice clinical name, dialectic behavior therapy. The first pioneers who developed this were able to say we were teaching some Buddhist technique. But then their students who learned it don't want to have anything to do with Buddhism. They are from all kinds of traditions. And when you teach, and now their students have no clue that this has anything to do with Buddhism. So if you look at Buddhist psychology, particularly, its influence has been quite powerful in the West. One of the persons I had a close encounter with in this regard was a very eminent neuroscientist in France called Francisco Varela. Francisco Varela was ordained as a Tibetan monk by Dalai Lama. He was very close to the Dalai Lama. He had a professional career in biology and neuroscience. He invented terms for Buddhist phenomena like autopoiesis, the embodied mind, neurophenomenology, and so on. So I met him at this Tucson conference, same place. In fact, we were stranded at the Tucson airport because of some bad weather. We were just sitting there, flight cancelled, and we had a lot of time to talk. So I said to him that why are you not saying that you're really teaching and researching Buddhism? What's wrong? So he also gave me this business about, when he teaches it, a Westerner, a scientist, it adds credibility, makes it glory for Buddhists, whereas if a Buddhist teaches it, nobody will believe it, so he was doing Buddhism a favor. He gave me all this kind of argument. So then I said, neurophenomenology is your technique. How many neurophenomenology practitioners have you produced who can create the same effects as the Tibetan Buddhists you are measuring? And why is it that when you want to do measurements, you always have to go looking for Tibetan Buddhist practitioners? If there is such a thing called neurophenomenology technique, then you should have a clinic where you're teaching, you should have a training academy where you're training neurophenomenologists, and then you ought to be measuring them. And he was dumbfounded but he was very honest, and he said, actually, we are not able to, it's a kind of a theoretical framework called neurophenomenology, but there really aren't actual practitioners of it. So then after a long time, he said, I do understand the value if I were to acknowledge it, so I'm going to start mentioning it more openly that this is Buddhism. But unfortunately, a few months later, he died. He had cancer, he died. I lost a friend because we would argue a lot, but I consider him to be a pretty decent fellow. Now, somebody developed something called the Mind Life Institute in the 1980s, which was top American scientists, both in the medical neuroscience field, psychology field, and physics and all of that, all very highly funded, and the Dalai Lama's people, a long project where they meet once a year for several weeks, and they basically, it's the Westerners picking the brains of the Tibetans, measuring, picking brains, discussing, arguing, presenting papers. So they're really appropriating and mining the Tibetans. So the Buddhism from them. So whenever I've criticized or complained, they've said, it's equal in both directions. We are not hiding from them. They can learn our knowledge. We're learning their knowledge and appropriating. They can learn our knowledge and appropriate. But then when I tell them that they don't have the money like you do to do anything with it, they don't have the funding, they don't have a whole army of scholars who can fly around the world and learn your stuff and enhance Tibetan Buddhism, they just don't have. They're poor people. Whereas you can pick their stuff more easily than they can pick your stuff. And they understand that. They understand that this is one way, it's asymmetric, because there's a power asymmetry. When there's a power asymmetry, I can learn more from you than you can learn from me. If I have more resources, I can take advantage of it, I can benefit from it. So the reverse is not so true. So this Mind Life Institute is a mining project where the Buddhist thought is being mined and processed and turned into mind sciences for the Western world. And there's a lot of, if you look at mind sciences, they do a conference every year, a lot of PR, a lot of material, a lot of videos, all of this stuff becoming more and more Western science, cognitive science, less and less anything to do with the Dharma or anything to do with Buddhism in particular. Then there is a person I also got to know called Owen Thompson. He's a young man, he is Francisco Varela's top student. So when Francisco Varela passed away, Owen Thompson continued that work. And Owen Thompson, this is often the case, that the first generation appropriator has little bit loyalty to his guru. He has that. And he has respect. And he also acknowledges when you ask him. But then he teaches other Westerners, and they teach other Westerners, and as it goes down from generation to generation, each generation has less and less acknowledgement of the source. They don't want anything to do with it. So Owen Thompson wants nothing to do with he says, I don't know whether my teacher Francisco Varela got it from Buddhism or where he got it from, I don't know. All I know is I learned it from him. And now Owen Thompson, he's a Christian, he's mapping it on to Christianity, these kind of models. So he's taken over this field in a big way and written a lot of things called self, no self, waking, dreaming, being, bestseller books in this kind of field, and they write very beautifully. Now I'll talk about how there is a movement to distort, to modify Buddhism. Very serious. So one person who's a cognitive neuroscientist at Duke University, and he's the boss of that young fellow who went to Benson and did all those photographs. He's the boss. So I got to know him through that friend of mine. This particular person in Duke University, Owen Flaganan, is one of the world authorities in certain models of neuroscience. Potential for a Nobel Prize. He's that kind of a big league. And he is developing something called Secularizing Buddhism, which means remove things from Buddhism which science cannot accommodate and claim that these things never existed. in Buddhism. So this secularizing Buddhism, they're removing things like anything to do with karma, anything to do with reincarnation, these kind of ideas there, because they don't know what, these things won't fit. So when you talk about the nature of the self and all that, they want to completely zap these. The other leader who is involved in naturalizing Buddhism is a man called Stephen Bachelor. He's a British guy. The previous one I mentioned is an American guy. And this Stephen Bachelor has been a Buddhist since the age of 18, settled in Dharamsala, spent a decade there, got married there. Then he suddenly shifted his loyalty, left, and now he teaches what is called naturalized Buddhism. Naturalized Buddhism means that he claims that Buddhism in its natural form, as taught by the Buddha, did not have things like karma and reincarnation, and some Brahmins added it later. So the whole karma reincarnation is a Brahmin interpolation that these guys, and so what we are doing is we are restoring the true Buddhism back, and that's their excuse for doing what they do. So then there is Sam Harris, and there's a lot of people like that. So then I have tables of what's the Indian term, who's the translator, and what's his new term. And if you look at the Indian vocabulary, it's disappeared. And the Indian sources and texts, gone, they're not needed. New ones have been created with a mixture of authenticity and inauthenticity, and now those are the origin, the starting point. The difference between Buddhism's acceptance, Buddhism spread in the East, Japan, China, Southeast Asia, etc., and its spread in the Western world must be understood. In the East, they haven't done these games. They're very clear that this came from India, so-and-so went, he brought this text. Many of the Buddhist texts in Chinese or Tibetan, they start by telling you which Sanskrit text or Pali text they're translating from. They're very respectful of the authentic source. Whereas in the West, I'm giving you examples, for one generation there is respect, but then that gets digested, diluted, passed down the pipeline, and further people learn without that same feeling, that feeling of admiration, and is not there. So Buddhism-based clinical therapies have come up: mindfulness, dialectic behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, etc. There's a whole lot of these therapies that are actually Buddhism derived. So in the end here I'm showing you there is a movement called consciousness studies. There's a wiki site where consciousness studies, and they are putting all the knowledge of consciousness into this wiki site, and there's hundreds of entries, thousands of entries. Very interesting thing is they divide the history of consciousness discovery into 3 periods: the early period, ancient period, then there is this middle period of 2000 years, and then there is the last few centuries. In the early period, they have 6 exemplars who are the original discoverers of consciousness. 5 of them are Western. The only non-Western is Buddha. So that's the origin. There's no Vedic Rishi. There is no Patanjali, Panini, Bhartrhari, all the great guys, not there. And then the 2000 year from that early, that BC period to recent times, it says there's an amazing gap of research on consciousness in this 2000 year period, and we are looking for sources. You see, they only want Western. So if they can't find Western, then according to them there's a gap. So all the stuff that our people did in that 2000 years is not of interest to them, because that's not what they're looking for. And then there is this latest period in which every one of the people they've named is a Westerner. I mean, they have David Hume, John Locke, Descartes, etc., all of these guys. They have 8 of them. There is not a single Indian. And then there is a table of contents of this book where it says the history of consciousness discoveries. There are 24 milestones. 23 of them are breakthroughs by Westerners. One is Buddha. That's the only Indian. So this is how it's ending up. So they have created a curriculum. They have created, Sunit Vermaji, we have a lot of work to do. They have created a curriculum. They got funding. You go to Massachusetts and you get a medical degree. You have an option to study mind-body medicine as an elective. Mind-body spiritual medicine is one of the electives in medical school. So in that they teach you the history of mind-body medicine, origins, who created, and it's people like Jon Kabat-Zinn who created, it's people like Benson who created. No evidence, not one sentence of anything to do with India having any of this, any relevance in the field. And that's what Indian doctors are also learning when they go there. I have a friend whose son went to med school and became a very big shot doctor somewhere, and then he was saying that he has gone to this mindfulness therapy session, training, and he's very successful. So I said, do you know it's Vipassana? And he was sort of like, what is he saying? Because people they get scared, they get suspicious of you. You must be a suspicious character if you start talking like that. And it's not polite conversation in a party that you start talking like that. This is the reaction often you get. So I've developed something called the U-turn theory, where this process of Westerners studying our culture, appropriating it, calling it their own, disguising the source, rejecting the source, it goes through 5 stages. Stage 1, good, honest student, disciple, researcher, really immersed in the tradition, will be wearing Indian clothes, maybe even got a Hindu name, maybe, doing bhajans, it's that kind of stage 1. And then some people stay there. They're wonderful. And then stage 2 is the person who turns it into something neutral, remove all the Indian stuff, turn it into his own very generic new proprietary, it's mine, I discovered this. And if you catch him and argue with him, he will say that, this is better because it'll spread better, easier when I do it like this. And then there is stage 3, when it's repackaged as one of 2 kinds, either repackaged as Judeo-Christian religion, there's a big market for that, like Christian yoga and a lot of things like that, or it gets repackaged as Western science. That's stage 3. So 3A path is through the religion, 3B path is through the science. Then stage 4 is you attack the source. They are abusive, they have caste system, they are otherworldly, they are not pragmatic, they are not progressive, they don't have positive psychology, they are all negative. This business of escapism. So they start looking for faults, which kind of rationalizes and justifies the theft. One psychology model, which I'm sure you guys study, is that there is a psychology of thief to talk himself into hating the victim because then it justifies his act. It's very interesting. I saw when there was a lot of crime in New York, it's no longer a crime-ridden place like it used to be. In the 70s when I was there was a talk show in which they were explaining that often when somebody comes and wants to steal your wallet and all that, it's very important for them to abuse you, vulgar, bad language and all that, because it's part of the psychological kind of reconciliation that what I'm doing is not bad because, he deserved it. He's a bad fellow. So this business of destroying from where you are plundering, it's sort of like arson, because the arsonist robs the bank, burns it down. He robs something, but he burns it down. So this stage 4 is where the there is the psychology of arson, because now they're going to, really hit out against the culture, whereas in stage 1 they were in love with it. A lot of people. Then there is stage 5, when this new made in America idea is re-exported to India, and the Indians absolutely love it. Wow. Like the IIT Kharagpur people, these 4 guys come and talk about all this stuff, it must be good only. So there is a complex. And also there is this Ken Wilber fashion, and this Michael, Murphy fashion, and all this kind of fashion. There are 4 methodologies, 4 things I'm studying in my project. One is I look at the Indian source. So I look at the Indian source, and it's of that particular thing, gurus, lineages, texts. Then I look at the Western pioneers of this trend who are studying these Indian sources, and I try to figure out where they got it from, try to talk to them, confront them. Then I study Western institutions. It's not just individuals, but it's also institutions. So SLN, Institute of Noetic Sciences, California Institute of Integral Studies, etc., Mind Life Institute. A lot of these institutes, there must be 100 institutes that I know. There's one in Stanford that just came up. So this very fashionable, cutting edge research is being institutionalized. It is not just individual who happen to go learn, write some books and become important, but now it is an institutional mechanism with very big funding to do this kind of a U-turn project on a large scale. This is going on. And then the 4th thing I study is what are the Western assets that they've created as a result of this? What's their market? How important is it? Is it authentic? Does it work? Is it compromised? What would happen if we replaced it with the original? Etc., etc. So I want to thank you for listening, and if there are people, one thing I want to say, if there are postgraduate type people who would like to be research assistants or join my project in any way, please contact me later on. And I'm looking to hire people, because I realized at this age I cannot finish all this work myself. I've got a huge amount of information, and after me it'll just fall apart because nobody will know what it is, how it fits. So I want to get help and organize this and quickly publish these, and it's material enough for a large number of volumes on the Indian influences on Western mind sciences. Thank you very much.